What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a sci-fi scanner. This model was based off of a concept from an artist named Jurij Andreev. He made a really great model. I believe his was an electromagnetic field meter, so that's probably what this model is based off of, but I just decided to call it a sci-fi scanner. Now this week's video is going to be a little bit different. It's just going to be more of a time-lapse video, so I won't be talking throughout the whole video, but I will be jumping in here and there just to explain some of the things I'm doing. So let's just get started. Alright, so to start things off, we're going to select the cube and we can start blocking out our shapes. Now I'm going to start off with the screen and the front handle object first, and then we can move on to a few others. So when I came across this image online, I didn't do a lot of planning and thinking about how I was actually going to tackle this. Usually when I do these YouTube videos, if I'm basing it off of some sort of reference, I'll stare at the image for a few minutes and figure out exactly how I'm going to tackle it. Now when it came to this week's model, I definitely didn't do that. I just jumped into it and decided to wing it along the way. Now looking back through these videos, I feel like I definitely would have done things differently. Firstly, I would have broken up the object much more and broken it down into smaller pieces. That way I feel like it would have been much easier to work with these shapes and probably would have cut down much of the modeling time. I also would have worked on just half of this object. Rather than creating all of the objects in their whole form, I would have just created half of them and then later on duplicated them over to create the other side. And there's a lot of benefits with doing this, not only with just cutting down the modeling time, but I also would have cut back like half of the UV space in my UV map, which would have resulted in even better quality textures. That being said, I still am really happy with the results and how the model turned out. I just feel like I could have done a much better job, and rather than just creating a really high poly model, I probably could have created something more game ready and also still had some better results. Now I decided to create a higher poly mesh just because I wanted to have some nice transitions between all those plastics. I really wanted to have some nice bevels, and rather than creating and breaking all of these pieces up, I thought I could have some nicer results if I just modeled it as one complete shape. Now that's where I believe I went wrong. I don't think it benefited the model too much, and it actually made the modeling process much longer. Now if you're familiar with this channel, you'll know I try to keep my modeling process around 2 hours in length in real time. Now this model ended up being like 3 or even closer to 4 hours. I definitely had tunnel vision, and next thing you know, time just flew by, and it was much longer than I was planning to do. So I definitely rushed a few things, especially when it came to the topology and some of those UVs. I just rushed through and did it really quickly, when usually I go back and just clean things up a little bit more. Because everything took so long, I just decided just to cut corners where I could. And actually because of that, you'll see later on in the texturing process, we have to jump back to Maya to do a few changes to our UV map, simply because I rushed it. So rather than looking at this week's video as a tutorial, it's more or less just a time-lapse video for fun. So let's just continue blocking things out, and then we can add some more details to our scene. Alright, so the first main object and front handle shape is complete. Next up is the other shape behind it. So let's go ahead and select another cube and we can start blocking that out. Alright, so now that we have majority of the objects blocked out, we can start beveling some of those edges. Now I don't want to go too crazy here because things can quickly get out of hand. I just want to make sure that these shapes are in their finalized positions before I go ahead and start beveling things. So I'm just going to take my time, make sure that all those shapes are looking good, and then we can start adding a few extra polys. And as you can probably tell, I'm hitting 3 on my keyboard to smooth out the object. So as I'm moving things around, I'm keeping it low in polys, but I am smoothing it out to see what the shape looks like whenever I eventually add those subdivisions. So let's go ahead and continue to move some things around to get it looking a little bit more like the Sci-Fi scanner. Alright, so the model's coming along and we're starting to slowly add those polys and it's starting to take shape. Now I thought it'd be different and fun to try to create some panels or some line work directly into the geometry. Now usually you would just create this directly in the texture, and we're going to do that as well when we get into Substance Painter, but I thought just to make this video a little bit different, we would add our own panel work or those lines directly into the geometry. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start cutting through some of these panels just by adding in some edge loops and beveling those out to extrude in a little area where that gap is going to go. And just like I said at the beginning of the video, this is where it would be handy to cut up the model a little bit more. I could actually break up these two panels into two separate pieces rather than just creating an extrusion right into the geometry. And that way I could even break it up more and have some cooler line work. So if I were to redo all of this, that's what I would probably do. Alright, so that is basically everything for the modeling. Now like I said, this one was a little rushed. I definitely just cut a few corners here and there, and the topology is definitely not my cleanest work, but I'm really still happy with how everything turned out, and it's all looking relatively good. So next up are those UVs. Now unfortunately, just to save time on this video since it's already long, I'm not going to show the whole UVing process, and I promise I will have more in future videos coming soon, but I will really quickly just go over exactly how I did those, and I'll show you what they look like. Alright, so here is the model in its finished form. Now what I ended up doing was smoothing it, adding a few extra subdivisions. I usually keep them on 1, however for this object specifically, I moved that up to 2 so I can have some really smooth edges. Now like I mentioned, this is definitely not necessary, and if I were to redo all of this, I would probably make it much lower on the poly side and more towards a game ready asset since all of this is really not necessary. However, it was still lots of fun, and it's good practice to make high poly models too. So I broke this thing up into 3 different textures for the 3 different groups applied. So on the very first group and texture, I have the main first handle and screen. And I do apologize for these UVs, I was definitely rushing it. I really should have just came back and straightened a lot of these UV shells. And you'll see soon enough when we start texturing, I actually have to come back to fix a few things. The second group and texture is the back parts, so just the back handle as well as the top of the battery. And then the third texture is just all the other objects, so the cord, the battery pack on the bottom, as well as this front little object and the little laser piece up here. I'm not even sure what this is, but it looks pretty cool. Anyways, that's exactly how I did those UVs, and now we can jump over to Substance Painter so we can start texturing. Alright, so now in Substance Painter, go load in your FBX file from Maya. And once that's loaded in, give it a quick look to make sure everything looks correct. And if it does, you can go over to your texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, go choose your output size, I chose 4K, and then make sure to check on use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. And you can leave everything else as is, and we can go bake out those textures. Alright, so since we want those glowing lights on this model, we need to go change our shader. So go to the top right corner to your shader settings and go change it to alpha blending. What that's going to do is allow us to add an emissive channel, so if you go down and hit that little plus icon, you can add an emissive channel to your textures. So let's go over to our texture 1, which is that main front handle, and we can start texturing it. So all I'm going to do here is go over to my Smart Materials tab, go choose one of those plastic materials, and I can apply it to the mesh. Then I'm going to open up the folder, tweak some of those settings. I'm going to turn off all that edge wear and the dirt and grunge. And then I'm just going to go change that color to more of a darker blue. Once I'm happy with that, I can right click, set it to a black mask and assign it to the mesh. And then I can add a fill layer and add my own dirt and grunge on top of that material. Alright, so that material's looking good. Next up are those little grips on the handle. So all I'm going to do for this is go back to my Smart Materials tab. I'm going to go choose that same material I use on the handle and all that plastic. But all I'm going to do for this one is just turn off all that bump and all that grunge, and then just change that color to more of a black. Then I'm just going to add a fill layer, turn off all of those channels. All I need is the height channel, and then I can go to my textures tab and drag on. At the very bottom of the list, there's this nice grid pattern you can use. It's like a tile generator, and I'm just going to drag that right onto my height channel, and then I can just tweak these settings to get a nice little bump effect on top of those grips. Now I noticed how there's such a hard edge from that material onto the plastic, and I didn't really like that. It looked not really realistic. And I liked how he did it in my reference. It was like a little edge on a border around it. So I quickly jumped back into Maya, and all I did, since there's already an edge running all around it, I just double clicked and added a seam, just one cut into the UV. That way I can bring it back in and add a different material to the outside of the border. So all I have to do is go up to Edit and Project Configuration, and then I just need to load in my new FBX. Make sure you check on that Preserve All Your Strokes so you don't lose all of your work, and then you can load in your new FBX file. And since I moved some of those UVs around and modified a few things, I need to make sure that I rebake my textures. Alright, so now that those textures are rebaked, I'm just going to reapply that same grip material I have, just without all of that bump. Alright, so now I'm just going to continue on and add a few other materials to all of the other meshes in the scene. Alright, so next up was the screen. Now I quickly jumped onto Google and found some random sci-fi tech UIs, and I just brought that into Photoshop and kind of made my own little UI screen. So all I did was save that as a PNG or a JPEG, and then I can drag that right into my project, set that as a texture, and then I can just paste that directly onto my mesh. Now I end up changing this later on near the end. I go back into Photoshop and just desaturate it a little bit to remove some of that color. But that's basically all I did for the screen. It was just all free images on Google. And I don't know if you can see that artifact that's reflecting on the screen, and that's just because I did a lazy job when I was rushing. When I smoothed out the object, it just created all these polys, and I thought it wouldn't really be noticeable, but clearly it was, so let's go fix that. So I'm going to jump back into Maya, and I'm just going to basically select a plane and replace that in the same position as the screen. I'm just going to remove all of those subdivisions because they're just unnecessary, and then fit it roughly into that same position. And once that's there, I can go ahead and delete the other old screen. And then I just need to really quickly UV it, so I'm just going to do a camera-based projection to remove all those cuts, and then I can just unfold it and lay it out on my UV map. And then I'm just going to move that to the side, go to the same group so I can see all the other UV shells, and then I can just fit that into that same position where the old one was. And then really quickly I just need to make sure to assign it to the same material since there's no material assigned, and then I can quickly export to bring back into Substance Painter. And then once again, go up to Edit Project Configuration, make sure to check on that Preserve Your Strokes, since you don't want to lose all your work, and then you can load in your updated model. Alright, so now no artifacts, so let's get back to business. Alright, so now moving on to the next texture in our texture set list, which is the other handle or piece of plastic behind it. So we're just going to do the exact same thing. I'm actually going to use the exact same materials. I'm just going to change the colors and tweak some of the other settings. So let's go ahead and we can apply other materials to all of these other meshes. So while I was applying these textures, I noticed how one of my UV shells were actually overlapping. Once again, because I was rushing, so I'm gonna jump back into Maya once again so I can move the shell over. And then while I was here, I noticed how I should probably just straighten out some of these shells where I want to add some other patterns on top of that texture. So all I'm going to do for this guy is just a cylindrical projection. Just because it's a circle or a cylinder, it just makes sense, and then all I have to do is just scale it inwards and turning on my grid pattern so I can make sure it's scaling correctly. And once that's looking correct, I can just fit that back into my UV map. So I just need to play a little bit of Tetris here and move some things around just so I can fit it back in. And then once again, because we moved some of those UV shells around, I just need to rebake those textures. Alright, so I wanted to add a caution pattern on the bottom of the cylinder, and because my UV shell is curved, I was unable to do that. So I quickly have to jump back into Maya so I can straighten out this UV shell, and then we can add that pattern. So to do that, I'm just going to select that UV shell, go over to my UV toolkit down to the Unfold tab, and I can straighten my UVs. Now a lot of the times when you have these really curved UV shells, it'll just produce all this messed up geometry, so you can just go in with your Optimize tool or your Unfold tool and clean that up. Now I'm having a problem selecting it here, so I'm just going to enlarge it first and then go in with my Optimize tool, and then I can clean up those areas. And then I just need to go back to my Straighten UVs tool and I can straighten it out properly. Now that things are looking good, all I have to do is scale that back small and fit it into that same spot it was in earlier. Once things are looking good, I can go ahead and export it and bring it back into Substance Painter. Alright, so I wanted to add a little caution symbol or a sticker on the side of this object. Now I first tried to use one of those built-in alphas in Substance Painter, but it just wasn't looking right and I didn't want it as see-through. So I quickly jumped back onto Google and just found some free to use caution symbol. And I just saved that as an image, brought that into Photoshop, removed the background, and then I brought that into my Substance Painter similar to how I did the screen and just set that as a texture into my current session. And then all I have to do is just take that and paste it directly onto my mesh. Alright, so all of those textures are applied, and now I'm just going to spend the next little bit just tweaking things. This is usually the longest part of the video, but I already spent so much time working on it. I'm just going to tweak a few things, and then we can wrap everything up. Alright, and that's basically everything. Now I just continued to tweak things a tiny bit, but that is basically the whole texturing and modeling process that I did to create this Sci-Fi scanner. Now I know this one was a little bit longer than usual. It was definitely a lot longer for me to make, and that's just because of how I approached this model. There are definitely a lot of things I would have done differently if I were to recreate it, and that really shows you why it's important to plan out the models and how you approach them. It really makes the whole creation of everything a lot smoother and easier. Anyways, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. Alright, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.